Chapter 11. The summer had been warm and balmy, even here in the foothills of the Alps. The Austrian countryside stretched out before them, a serene patchwork of green pastures and dense forests. Gino's command of German had proved invaluable in helping them find this secluded farmhouse, far removed from the highways and tourist crowds heading to Neuschwanstein Castle. The days had been almost cloudless and dry, with the world around them exuding a deceptive calmness. Gino maneuvered the old tractor into the clearing and stopped it beside the deep circular ditches they had dug. The ditches, concentric rings like the markings of a dartboard or spider web, were already bordered by boulders of various sizes and shapes. The trailer behind the tractor carried a single marble boulder, the last piece of the arrangement. He turned off the engine, climbed down, and wiped his brow before walking to inspect the boulder. "Hey, don't even think about moving that by yourself, old-timer," came Vandar's voice from the woods. Gino looked up and saw Vandar and Teresa approaching. Vandar was pushing a wheelbarrow, while Teresa guided Shania's pram beside him. The nearly 2-year-old giggled and pointed at the scene, her dark eyes sparkling. "Why not?" Gino replied, laughing. "The fresh air has done me good. I feel 10 years younger." Vandar smirked as he parked the wheelbarrow next to the trailer. "Maybe so, but we need these rocks placed perfectly. No shortcuts, Gino." Gino chuckled and stepped down from the trailer, shaking his head. "You're the boss, son," he said with a mock bow, walking over to the pram. He knelt to greet Shania, who immediately grabbed his finger and tugged at it playfully. Her laughter brought a warm smile to his face. As he stood, Gino's expression turned thoughtful. "I can't help but worry about our money situation," he admitted. Teresa gave a knowing smile. "Don't. It's December 30th, right?" Gino nodded. "Well," she explained, "when the time gates reset things for the new year, all the money we've spent won't have been spent at all." Because none of this was supposed to happen in the original version of 1995, Gino said, his smile returning as he caught on. "Exactly," Teresa replied. "She's been spending the same 30,000 euros over and over," Vandar added with a wry grin. Gino raised an eyebrow. "And the account is still open?" Teresa shrugged. "Technically, it never closes." Vandar turned his focus back to the clearing. "We need to finish this," he said, his tone serious. "New Year's Eve is almost here." Vandar moved the wheelbarrow closer to the trailer as Gino steadied it. Together, they maneuvered the final marble boulder into place. Vandar grunted with effort as he rolled it toward the last hollowed-out spot in the soil. He heaved the wheelbarrow handles upward, letting the rock slide down into its place with a dull thud. He sank onto the stone, wiping sweat from his brow, and surveyed the completed arrangement. "You've done it," Teresa said, walking up beside him with Shania in her arms. Her voice carried a mix of pride and concern. Vandar stood and began pointing to the stones, his excitement evident. "Horus," he said, gesturing to a large rock on the outer circle. "Earth, Saturn, Jupiter, the Sun," he continued, pointing to the central arrangement of smaller stones. Gino followed his gestures, nodding thoughtfully. "Station stones?" he asked, noticing the smaller rocks forming the perimeter. "They represent the edges of the galaxy," Vandar explained. "The Milky Way." Finally, Vandar knelt by a solitary stone set apart from the rest. He placed a hand on it, his expression heavy. "And this one, the time gates." Gino frowned as he watched Vandar linger by the stone. "Will it work?" he asked, his voice low. Vandar hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "What happens if it doesn't?" Gino pressed. "To Teresa, to me." Vandar sighed deeply, standing to face him. "If it doesn't work, you'll vanish. You'll return to where you would have been in the world the time gates dictate." For 1995, Gino's face tightened. "And where is that?" he demanded. Vandar looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Anywhere. Perhaps you'd still be alive, perhaps not." The weight of his words hung in the air. Gino paced restlessly, his unease growing. "This is a gamble, Vandar, a huge one." "I know," Vandar said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Do you think I haven't thought about this? I've gone over every possibility. This arrangement will shield us, just like Stonehenge. The ley lines here are strong enough to keep us safe." Teresa stepped forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Vandar, we need to consider the alternative." "No," Vandar snapped, spinning to face her. "It will work." "But if it doesn't?" she pressed, her eyes searching his. "What then?" Vandar hesitated, his resolve wavering. "I'll find you," he said finally. "Even if you don't remember me, I'll find you." Gino shook his head, his expression a mix of skepticism and sorrow. "And what will you do when we don't believe you? When we see you as a madman claiming to know us?" Teresa's voice broke as tears welled in her eyes. "We can't even leave ourselves a message," she whispered. "The letters would disappear." Vandar shut his eyes, his shoulders trembling. "It'll work," he said hoarsely. "It has to work." Teresa walked to his side and embraced him as he wept. Gino sat down heavily on one of the stones, his thoughts consumed by everything they stood to lose. The year they'd spent together, the insights he'd gained about life and time. None of it would matter if the time gates erased it all. He would live out an ordinary life, ignorant of what had been stolen from him. Vandar wiped his tears and looked at Gino and Teresa, his resolve hardening. "We can't risk going back to the ley line in England. The Carnos will be waiting for us. They expect us to return. Even if we survived, they could track us." Gino nodded, understanding the risk. Vandar knelt by the pram and looked into Shania's curious eyes. "My vision won't fail us. I promise you, I'll bring us all back here, together." Teresa's gaze softened, her love for him shining through her tears. She placed a hand on his cheek. "We trust you," she said quietly. Vandar leaned forward and kissed her, sealing his vow. Chapter 12. The two men sat on the tractor, watching the river's waters shimmer under the bright afternoon sun. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind that seemed endless in the Austrian summer. They had just finished the final touches on the stone arrangement and decided to rest before heading back to the farmhouse. Gino wiped his brow and glanced at Vandar, who was drinking deeply from a water bottle. "So, who built the time gates?" Gino asked, his voice breaking the tranquil silence. Vandar paused mid-drink, his expression contemplative. He studied Gino for a moment, as if weighing whether he was ready to hear the answer. Turning his gaze to the sparkling river, Vandar began, his voice low and measured. "The Kaldros," he said. "He conquered all the free worlds and laid waste to his enemies. His army was unstoppable, moving at speeds no one else could match." Vandar kicked a small stone at his feet, sending it tumbling toward the water's edge. For 500 years, he ruled the universe. He ordered the construction of the time gates at the cost of countless lives, obliterating planets and civilizations to achieve his vision. Even so, their existence was kept secret from the greater empire. "Why keep it a secret?" Gino asked, frowning. Vandar turned to him. The time gates were the key to his absolute control. If anyone learned of them, if they discovered how the Kaldrosdom's power worked, they would know how to bring it all down. Gino stared at the young man beside him. the river reflecting flickers of sunlight on Vandar's serious face. This mysterious figure, who seemed to know so much about unimaginable things, suddenly felt more distant and enigmatic. Gino realized just how little he truly knew about him. "Who are you, really?" Gino asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and unease. Vandar took a breath and removed the metal bracelet he had often held in moments of reflection. He handed it to Gino. "I am the one who received the message from Tralonu ek Busca," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Tralonu ek—" Gino took the bracelet, inspecting it with newfound curiosity. It was a striking piece, its surface adorned with intricate symbols and strange, unfamiliar script. He ran his fingers over the patterns, marveling at its craftsmanship. "That belonged to Tralonu," Vandar said, his gaze distant as if recalling a memory. "He wore it for many lonely years. He told me the Kaldros dam must end. The balance of the galaxy must be restored." Gino handed the bracelet back, his face a mixture of skepticism and wonder. "And he spoke to you? Personally?" "Yes," Vandar replied with a faint smile, sensing Gino's doubt. "He gave me a mission." Vandar's smile grew wider, and he let out a soft laugh. "Would you like to truly understand, Gino?" "Yes," Gino said, his tone resolute. "I would." "Then come with me," Vandar said, rising to his feet. "I'll show you what lies in the heavens." Vandar led Gino to a flat, grassy patch near the riverbank. The sunlight gleamed on the water, and the rustling of leaves added a tranquil rhythm to the scene. "Sit here," Vandar said, extending a hand to help Gino lower himself onto the dry soil. Gino accepted the gesture, settling in with a grunt. Vandar sat cross-legged across from him, holding his hands out. "Take my hands, and don't let go until we return." Gino hesitated, then grasped Vandar's hands. "What exactly are we doing?" "Trust me," Vandar said, his grip tightening. "Close your eyes." Gino obeyed, though he couldn't ignore the heat of the sun on his face or the itch of the dry summer air. His restlessness grew as sweat trickled down his temple. But then, just as he was about to complain, a profound calmness washed over him. The warmth of the sun vanished. The sound of the river and the insects faded into silence. When he opened his eyes, he gasped. They were no longer on Earth. Gino found himself in a vast black expanse, an infinite void. Small, dim stars began to flicker into existence around him, gradually growing brighter until the night sky was alive with light. He floated, weightless, surrounded by the majesty of the cosmos. The stars moved, their brilliance stretching into streaks of light as they traveled across his vision. Awe gripped him. He couldn't comprehend how he was here, suspended in the universe's endless expanse. Somehow, he felt Vandar's presence, though he couldn't see him. Then Vandar's voice, steady and calm, resonated in his mind. "Get ready, we're going to move." Before Gino could respond, they hurtled through space. A distant star grew rapidly, transforming from a speck into a massive, burning sphere. Its fiery arms of heat reached toward them, radiating unimaginable energy. They lingered near it for a moment, Gino captivated by its terrifying beauty. "That star is my point of reference," Vandar said. "It guides me to the beast." "The beast?" Gino asked, his unease growing. "Yes," Vandar replied. "You'll feel it soon." As they moved again, faster than before, Gino felt a wave of dread creeping over him. A cold, oppressive emptiness weighed on his soul. "What is this feeling?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You're sensing Horus." Gino turned toward the source of the foreboding sensation and froze. In the distance, an incomprehensibly vast spiral loomed, its swirling colors pulling him into its gravitational grasp. At its center was an all-consuming black void, a black hole of unimaginable size. Even from this unfathomable distance, it dominated the heavens, devouring stars, planets, entire galaxies. Suns were crushed into nothingness, their light extinguished as they were consumed. The sheer scale of its destruction overwhelmed Gino. He felt utterly insignificant, helpless against its insatiable hunger. His entire body trembled. Gino woke with a jolt, gasping for air. The riverbank was back, the sound of flowing water and chirping birds grounding him. He ran a hand over his damp face, his heart racing. Vandar sat calmly beside him, a knowing smile on his face. "So," he said softly, "are your eyes open now?" Gino looked at him, pale and shaken. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. Vandar chuckled, the sound both comforting and enigmatic. "Good." Gino stared at him, the weight of what he had seen pressing heavily on his mind. For the first time, he truly believed Vandar, and it terrified him. Chapter 13. Vandar pushed open the farmhouse door, the cool air from outside following him in. His boots echoed softly against the wooden floor as he moved through the rooms. "Teresa, Shania," he called. "Up here," came Teresa's voice from the bedroom. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding. When he reached the room, he found her cradling Shania in her arms, the child half asleep, her small hand gripping the edge of her mother's blouse. Vandar sat on the edge of the bed, his presence tender yet heavy with exhaustion. He reached out to touch his daughter's cheek, her skin warm and soft beneath his fingers. "It's finished," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The arrangement. It'll keep you and Shania here, with me." Teresa's eyes glistened, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "Vandar," she began, her voice cracking. "No," he interrupted gently, brushing away a tear as it slipped down her cheek. "Don't say it. If it doesn't work—" "Stop," he pleaded, his own tears threatening to fall. "It will. If it doesn't," she continued firmly, her voice steadying despite her emotion, "you need to know that I accepted the risk. I chose this. Here in Austria, or back in England, there was always a chance we wouldn't make it. But if we don't—" She paused, her gaze locking onto his. "It's not your fault. Promise me you'll keep going. You'll find a way." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "Teresa, I can't—" "You can," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "Because you must, for Shania, for the future." Vandar pulled her into his arms, holding her as though sheer will alone could prevent anything from taking her away. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "And no matter what happens, I always will." Chapter 14. New Year's Eve was unnaturally warm, the still air heavy with anticipation. The sun had sunk behind the jagged outline of the Alps, its final rays bleeding into the sky in shades of molten gold and deep crimson. By 10 o'clock, the darkness had settled, broken only by the flickering light of a bonfire in the clearing. They sat close to the flames, their shadows shifting across the arrangement of stones. Shania slept soundly in her pram, her soft breaths drowned out by the crackle of burning wood. It was a quiet gathering, each of them lost in their thoughts. As the hour crept closer to midnight, the tension grew palpable. Vandar wrapped an arm around Teresa, holding her close. His hands were cold and clammy, and she could feel the tremble in his touch. "It'll work," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Teresa said nothing, only leaning into him. Nearby, Gino pretended to be unaffected, sipping Chianti and nibbling on a piece of panettone. but his jovial facade crumbled as the minutes ticked by, his glances at the sky growing more frequent. Finally, he set his glass aside and sighed heavily. "Let's get to it," he said, standing. Teresa rose and took her father's hand, guiding him to the center of the stone circle marked out with smaller rocks. Vandar followed, lifting Shania from her pram. "My little girl," he whispered, cradling her close. He kissed her forehead, his tears glistening in the firelight. The weight of what he was about to do settled over him like a shroud. He memorized every detail of her face, her tiny nose, her soft curls, the peaceful expression that only a child could wear. "I love you," he choked out, his voice breaking under the strain. He walked slowly, each step feeling like a lifetime, until he reached Teresa and Gino. "The time is upon us," Gino said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Vandar handed Shania to Teresa and kissed her deeply. "I love you," she whispered. He nodded, his smile weak but determined. Turning to Gino, he raised his hand in a small salute. "Take care of them," Vandar said. Gino returned the gesture, his eyes glistening. Vandar stepped back, looking up at the sky. The darkness was softening, shifting to a deep blue as the stars burned brighter. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, stirring the trees. He raised his arm, the symbols on his wristband glowing faintly in response. "Let it work, Tralonu ek Busca," he prayed. "Let it carry them through." Thunder cracked overhead, and the stars began to swirl. Their movements were no longer random but synchronized, as if part of some great celestial dance. Vandar gasped. "He knows!" The sky seemed to come alive, the Milky Way spinning like a tidal wave of light. Brilliant streaks of color arced across the heavens, illuminating the clearing. "It's working!" Vandar shouted, his voice filled with relief. Teresa tilted her head back, her face alight with awe. The winds grew stronger, whipping her hair around her face. Then, from the shadows of the forest, a sudden flash of light erupted. Gino cried out as the impact struck him square in the chest, his body flung several meters from the circle. Teresa screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Vandar turned toward the source of the attack, his stomach sinking. Emerging from the tree line was a woman with fiery red hair, dressed in the black uniform of the Kaldrosdom's elite. She holstered her pistol and broke into a sprint, moving with lethal precision. "Memphis," Vandar whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. The woman vaulted over one of the outer stones, her movements fluid and controlled. Vandar snapped out of his daze and bolted toward Teresa, desperate to intercept her before it was too late. Teresa crouched over Gino, her heart hammering. "Dad?" she called, shaking his shoulder. He didn't respond. Smoke rose from the charred wound in his side, and his breathing was faint, if there at all. Shania stirred in her arms, wide-eyed and frightened. Teresa held her closer, willing herself to stay calm. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Memphis was closing in, her expression cold and determined. Teresa's instincts screamed danger. She clutched Shania tightly and tried to run, but Memphis was too fast. The red-haired woman lunged, but a heavy impact sent her sprawling. Vandar tackled her to the ground, pinning her briefly before she freed herself with a flurry of blows. Both combatants scrambled to their feet, their eyes locking in a deadly standoff. "Vandar Manak," Memphis sneered, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "Your fight is with me," Vandar said, his tone ice-cold. "Leave them out of this." Memphis smirked. "Oh, Vandar, you really thought you could escape the time gates? Ilores told me everything." Vandar's stomach turned. "You're making a mistake." Memphis circled him like a predator, her pistol raised. Vandar risked a glance at his watch, 45 seconds to midnight. "Teresa!" he shouted. "Take Shania to the center. Now!" Teresa hesitated, her heart breaking as she looked at Gino. But she knew Vandar was right. She backed toward the center of the stones, her steps unsteady. Vandar's voice snapped her focus back. "In the circle, and don't move." Memphis lunged, but Vandar was faster, knocking her pistol from her hand with a swift kick. The weapon skittered across the clearing, disappearing among the stones. Memphis growled in frustration and unleashed a barrage of kicks, each one landing with brutal precision. Vandar staggered, dazed, and Memphis pounced. She wrapped a cord around his neck, pulling it tight. Vandar gasped, clawing at the cord as his vision darkened. Teresa watched in horror, torn between helping him and staying in the circle. Her eyes darted to the sky. Midnight was seconds away. She grabbed an empty Chianti bottle and hurled it with all her strength. The bottle struck Memphis's head with a resounding crack. She stumbled, releasing Vandar, who collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Memphis staggered to her feet, blood dripping from her temple. She retrieved her pistol and aimed it at Teresa. "You're done," she snarled. Vandar forced himself to stand, his vision blurred and his body weak. "Stay in the circle, Teresa," he croaked. His watch beeped, midnight. Memphis squeezed the trigger. But before the shot could land, Teresa and Shania were consumed by a radiant burst of light. The energy engulfed them, blinding Memphis. Her shot went wide, hitting one of the stones. When the light faded, Teresa and Shania were gone. Vandar staggered forward, his fist colliding with Memphis's jaw. She crumpled to the ground unconscious. The clearing was silent. Vandar fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. They were gone. But then he heard it, a soft, familiar chuckle. He turned toward the stones, his breath catching. Shania sat there unharmed, her tiny laugh cutting through the silence. Vandar scooped her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You're still here," he whispered. "You're still here." As the first light of dawn broke over the Alps, Vandar drove south into Italy, leaving the clearing and Memphis behind. He had lost so much, but as he glanced at Shania in the rearview mirror, he knew he still had hope. Chapter 15. The years that followed were heavy with loneliness, especially the first. Life without Teresa felt like losing a vital part of himself, a wound that refused to heal. She wasn't just his companion. She had been his anchor, his guide through the chaos of their shared existence. Her absence left a void so profound that some days it was all Vandar could do to care for Shania. Teresa had believed in him when others doubted, had grown with him, and had inspired him to find meaning in the madness. Now, that inspiration felt distant. Every night, Vandar relived the events in the Alps, replaying every decision, every moment. He couldn't help but wonder, could I have done something differently? Could I have saved her? The questions haunted him for years, mingling with anger and guilt. But eventually, Vandar came to accept that the past was unchangeable. No amount of grief or regret would bring her back. The only thing he could do was focus on the one light in his life, Shania. She was his joy, his purpose, and the thread that kept him tied to the world. At first, he avoided people entirely, withdrawing from the complexities of social life. His nomadic lifestyle, driven by the need to evade Memphis and the Kaldros, left little room for connections. Besides, he didn't want to face the endless questions about his odd circumstances, especially as a single father with a baby in tow. But as Shania grew, Vandar realized she needed more than the life he was giving her. She needed friends, a home, and a sense of belonging. He couldn't let his grief or fears rob her of a childhood, and so he made a decision. They would settle down. Fearing Memphis might track them if they stayed in Italy, Vandar chose the quiet safety of the English countryside. In the picturesque village of Kingsclear, Nestled in Berkshire's rolling hills, he found a place where they could begin again. Even amidst the challenges, one truth sustained him. Shania was different. That night in the Alps had proven it. When Teresa vanished in the blinding flash of light, returned to the timeline dictated by the time gates, Shania had not. She had fallen to the grass just outside the circle of stones. Midnight came and went, but she remained. The time gates didn't recognize her just as they didn't recognize him. Each new year, while the rest of the world reset and forgot their existence, Shania stayed. Vandar pondered this mystery during countless sleepless nights, the alien symbols on his wristband offering no answers. Why was she immune? What did it mean for their future? Some nights he wondered if Teresa had been right to believe he was meant for something greater. Or was their existence outside the time gates merely a cruel twist of fate? A life more difficult and strange simply because life was often unfair. Shania, however, didn't dwell on such questions. She was vibrant and curious, with an insatiable love for the outdoors. She and Vandar spent endless days exploring the countryside, fishing in quiet streams, or wandering through the woods. At 5, she begged for a dog, undeterred by the peculiar truth that they could only keep one for a year. Vandar worried the yearly goodbyes would break her heart, but Shania surprised him. She grieved each time they said goodbye to one pet, but her resilience shone through as she welcomed the next with equal love. Her adaptability amazed him. Unlike Teresa or Gino, Shania embraced life outside the time gates with a quiet strength. Even when teachers or parents asked strange questions, like why people seemed to forget her at the end of each year, she learned to navigate those challenges with grace. There were moments when the weight of their unusual life became too much, especially as a young girl grappling with things beyond her understanding. But Shania was determined and resourceful. She quickly realized she was different and that some truths were best kept secret. Vandar treasured every moment with her. She had her mother's kindness and warmth, and she became not just his daughter but his closest companion. The years passed in a blur of shared adventures and quiet evenings. By the time Shania was 10, she was already her own person, intelligent, compassionate, and endlessly supportive of her father. Together, they built a life in the shadows of the ordinary world, bound by love, resilience, and the shared knowledge that their path was unlike any other. Chapter 16. The years passed, and before Vandar realized it, Shania was a teenager. She had grown into a sharp, independent young woman, her curiosity and determination a constant source of pride, an occasional challenge. But now, as she edged closer to adulthood, she was beginning to wrestle with questions that Vandar had known would come. Questions he wasn't sure he could answer. For the first time, her differences from others began to matter, and the reason was Richard. Richard Brooks lived down the road, a typical English lad with a cheeky grin and a love for cars and football, but he was also kind, polite, and, Vandar had to admit, charmingly earnest. He spent every spare moment with Shania, and Vandar didn't mind. Richard wasn't a yob like some of the other neighborhood boys, and he had a good head on his shoulders. Still, Vandar couldn't help but notice the way Shania had been preoccupied lately, her usual confidence giving way to moments of quiet doubt. One evening, the tension finally surfaced. September, October, November, and December. Vandar glanced up from the sink, his hands submerged in soapy water, and raised an eyebrow at Shania's odd remark. She stood leaning against the fridge, arms folded tightly across her chest. "You've got it right, if that's what you're asking," he said with a small smile, turning back to the dishes. She sighed, her fingers drumming against her arm. Vandar wiped a plate and set it aside. "Out with it," he said, his tone light but probing. "What?" she replied, her voice strained with an edge of defensiveness. "What's bothering you?" he asked, turning to face her fully. For a moment she hesitated, staring at the floor as though searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but weighted with unspoken fears. "When January comes, he won't remember me, will he?" Vandar's hands stilled. He turned back to her, drying his hands with a tea towel, and met her gaze. "Who?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. She bit her lip, refusing to look at him. "Oh," he said, understanding dawning. "Richard?" She nodded, her shoulders sagging as she let out a shaky breath. Vandar studied her carefully. She wasn't his little girl anymore. Her growing confidence and independence were evident, and yet, in this moment, she seemed as vulnerable as the child who had clung to him in the aftermath of the Alps. "It's something we can't control," he said quietly. "But I like him, Dad," she said, her voice breaking with frustration. Vandar sighed, his heart heavy. "I know, honey, but we're different." Her head snapped up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are we different?" she demanded. "I don't want to be this way." Vandar stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as she cried into his chest. He could feel the years of questions, doubt, and frustration pouring out of her in those tears. For a long moment the kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the fridge and the occasional drip from the faucet. Finally, Shania pulled back, brushing her tears away with trembling fingers. Her voice steadied, though her eyes still glistened. "Really, Dad," she said, her tone more resolute, "I've always just accepted it before, but I can't anymore. I need to know. Why am I like this? Why us?" Vandar sighed, gesturing for her to sit at the kitchen table. He followed, pulling out a chair across from her. For a moment, he sat in silence, studying her face. She had Teresa's determination and warmth, and the thought of disappointing her cut deeper than he cared to admit. "You're going to hear some things you won't like," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "I'm ready," she replied, meeting his gaze without wavering. Vandar nodded, his heart aching. He had dreaded this conversation for years, knowing it would bring more questions than answers. But he owed her the truth, or at least as much of it as he understood. Part 2. The Trials of Vandar. Chapter 17. After bringing the planet Ethses to its knees, Commander Vandar Manak returned with his unit to the mothership. Victory was predictable, yet the crew celebrated with the fervor of true believers. Drinks, laughter, and games filled the corridors, their voices rising in a chorus of devotion. "Long live the Kaldros! Grant him 1,000 more years!" The mothership cut through the void of space, its next destination looming on the horizon. Jupiter. Rebellion awaited, but for now, the soldiers were granted 145 Earth hours of rest. A brief reprieve, though never truly restful. The shadow of war always lingered. Vandar joined the celebrations for a time, raising a glass to the Kaldros alongside his comrades. Yet, as the night wore on, he felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in. His body ached, his muscles heavy from battle. Victory may have been sweet, but the toll was undeniable. Eventually, he retreated to his quarters. The sterile silence of the small room felt like a balm. He climbed into his bunk, letting his eyes close as exhaustion pulled him into its depths. The sleep came easily, deep and heavy, but just as easily it was broken. Vandar stirred, rolling onto his side in search of comfort. That's when he heard it. A faint wheeze, deep in his throat. He froze, listening carefully. The sound was barely perceptible, almost buried beneath the steady thrum of his pulse. For a moment he thought it was gone, but then he realized the wheeze wasn't tied to his breathing. It was in sync with his heartbeat. Unease prickled at the edges of his thoughts. He pressed 2 fingers to his throat, feeling his pulse. The sound was there, faint but rhythmic, perfectly aligned with the beat of his heart. Vandar swung his legs over the side of the bunk and made his way to the small bathroom adjoining his quarters. The fluorescent light flickered slightly as he leaned over the sink, staring into the mirror. His face looked normal, calm even, but the sound persisted. He pressed his fingers along his throat, searching for a lump or irregularity, but felt nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the noise was there, a crackling rhythm that refused to leave his mind. Opening the medkit mounted on the wall, he retrieved a pair of medical tongs. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the cold, gleaming metal in his hand. Then, gritting his teeth, he opened his mouth and carefully inserted the tongs. The sensation was uncomfortable, but he pushed deeper, probing until he felt resistance. Something solid. His breath hitched. It wasn't a part of him. Vandar opened the tongs slightly, gripping the object, and withdrew them. He gagged and coughed, mucus splattering into the sink. When he finally looked at the end of the tongs, his stomach twisted. A tiny parasite wriggled in their grasp. Its back was hard, like a glossy black shell, while its underside was pale and soft. Its bloated belly, filled with dark red blood, pulsed faintly. Vandar stared, horrified, as he realized it had been feeding on him. 2 small black eyes sat on its grotesque face, unseeing yet somehow menacing. It writhed, its barbed legs rasping together, scraping against the tongs as it squirmed. Vandar's breath quickened. It felt as if the creature was watching him, planning its way back inside. Disgust surged through him, and he flung it into the corner of the bathroom. Without hesitation, he crushed it under his boot, the crunch of its shell shattering, echoing in the small space. He leaned over the sink, gagging, bile rising in his throat. But he stopped short of vomiting. His mind raced, questions tumbling over each other. What was that thing? How did it get there? Has it been inside me for days? Weeks? The thought of its barbed legs lodged in his throat. Its belly swelling with his blood made him shudder. He rinsed his mouth, trying to steady his breathing. After a long moment, he decided no one could know about this. The medics were ruthless, and any weakness would mark him as expendable. Over the next few days, Vandar did his best to act normal. Though he ran a fever and felt drained, he refused to visit the medics. Instead, he pushed through the discomfort, waiting for his body to recover. When his strength returned, he noticed something different. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the mind. But it persisted. He felt sharper, more reflective. His thoughts, once laser-focused on obedience and duty, began to stray. He started noticing things he hadn't before. The clumsiness of his comrades, their blind adherence to orders. They were efficient, yes, but they were also unthinking, reliant on brute force to solve problems. Their simplicity irritated him in a way it never had before. Why now, he wondered. Was it the parasite? Had it somehow dulled my mind, and now, without it, I'm seeing clearly, or has something changed in me because of it? He caught himself questioning orders, not outwardly but in his mind. He weighed the morality of their campaigns, something he had never done before. Still, Vandar knew better than to speak of these thoughts. The Kaldros valued loyalty above all else, and questioning authority was a dangerous path. He told himself he would stay low profile, recover fully, and return to active service. But in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, doubt crept in. What if the parasite was more than a parasite? What if it changed me? Vandar stared at the walls of his quarters, the silence pressing in. For the first time in years, he wondered not just about his next mission, but about himself. Chapter 18. The mothership entered Jupiter's orbit, its shadow cutting through the swirling storm clouds below. The gas giant's atmosphere raged in shades of orange and red, its hurricane-force winds an unending chaos. Small, offensive ships descended from the mothership, plunging into the tempest toward their objective. The captured entrances to the miners' labyrinthine tunnels. Vandar Manak stood in the landing bay as his ship touched down. The cavernous chamber vibrated faintly, the distant roar of Jupiter's storms reverberating through the walls. Soldiers shouted orders over the noise of unloading equipment, their movements efficient and practiced. Vandar watched his unit with the eye of a commander, ensuring everything was in order. "You're lucky to have made it down here alive," the marshal said, appearing beside him. Vandar turned to the man, his expression neutral. "I personally believe Jupiter's atmosphere to be the worst to land through in the entire solar system, at least among the outer planets," the marshal continued, his tone half joking but edged with truth. Vandar shrugged, his focus still on the troopers. "What are our orders?" The marshal's grin faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "The rebels are fighting a strong defense. This won't be a quick operation." He gestured to a group of soldiers inspecting drilling equipment. "The tunnel system is a nightmare. It's impossible to fully secure a sector without overwhelming manpower. The miners know the terrain better than we ever could, and they've rigged traps everywhere." Vandar nodded, already considering the tactical implications. "Why have the miners turned on the Kaldros?" The marshal hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice. "It's believed they're stalling for time, trying to arrange transport off the planet, to the Genoan system." Vandar raised an eyebrow. "Transport for what?" The marshal avoided his gaze. "That's above my pay grade," he said curtly. Vandar frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he shifted his thoughts to the rebels' position. "They can't win. The air supply has been terminated," the marshal interrupted. "In 6 days, the atmosphere in the tunnels will no longer be breathable. Resistance won't last a week." Vandar's tactical mind churned. The situation seemed straightforward. Cut off from breathable air, the rebels' defeat was inevitable. Yet, the Kaldros' orders to act now suggested something urgent, something worth risking lives to obtain. What could be so vital that the Kaldros won't simply wait them out? Vandar wondered aloud. The marshal stopped walking and turned to him, his expression calculated. "Orders came directly from Ilores and the Kaldros. Even the Carnos are being sent in. Whatever the miners are hiding, it's important." Vandar stiffened slightly at the mention of the Carnos, the Kaldros' elite warriors, feared even among the highest ranks. The marshal's tone shifted, becoming almost conspiratorial. "I've found a way into the heart of the rebel compound," he said. "An old construction tunnel left from the days when this city was being built. It could take you and a select group of soldiers directly into the center of their operations. You could capture whatever it is they're protecting and bring glory to the Kaldros." Vandar felt a flicker of instinctive pride at the words. Glory for the Kaldros, honor for his unit. It was what he had been trained to desire, but beneath the surface, a shadow of doubt crept in. "You have a reputation, Vandar Manak," the marshal continued, his tone smooth and persuasive. "Your unit boasts high success and low mortality rates. Complete this mission, and you could be on the path to joining the Carnos themselves." Vandar's chest tightened. The offer should have filled him with pride, but instead it felt hollow. The doubts he had buried since the incident on the mothership stirred once more. Why should I risk myself for the Kaldros' glory? The thought was treasonous, unthinkable. Yet it refused to leave his mind. For the first time in his career, Vandar felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against the doctrines he had once held sacred. He glanced at the marshal, whose grin had faded into a faint frown of suspicion. Vandar realized he had been silent too long. "For the glory of the Kaldros," Vandar declared sharply, raising a salute. The marshal's grin returned. "Excellent. Ready your men? I'll brief you in 20 minutes. Vandar nodded, watching as the marshal walked away, his polished boots clicking against the stone floor. When the man was gone, Vandar exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest refusing to dissipate. "What's happening to me?" he thought. "Am I losing my faith?" He turned to watch his unit as they prepared for the mission. They moved with disciplined efficiency, their faces alight with determination and excitement. They believed in the Kaldros, in the righteousness of their cause. They trusted him to lead them. Chapter 19. The tunnel was pitch black, unbearably hot, and barely wide enough to crawl through. Vandar had chosen a dozen of his most skilled troopers for the mission, and now, after nearly an hour of crawling through the stifling pipe, they were drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Vandar, leading the way, reached the grate at the tunnel's end. The cool air beyond was a relief, and he silently thanked his position at the front as he retrieved his pocket torch. The hum of the tool echoed sharply in the oppressive silence as he worked to cut through the metal. After a few minutes, the grate gave way, and Vandar wrenched it free. When he turned to check on his team, the count was 10. 2 men had collapsed from oxygen deprivation before reaching the exit. He glanced at the schematic display on his wrist. "Intelligence suggests these accommodation units are housing the leaders of the resistance," he said, pointing to a multi-level structure on the map. "Simple plan, mutual offensive and backup. Sweep the building from bottom to top, kill all targets." The troopers nodded grimly. "Let's move," Vandar ordered. The resistance was ill-prepared and disorganized, their defenses crumbling under the troopers' assault. The most difficult part of the mission was breaching the building's entrance. An explosive trap on the walkway claimed 2 more soldiers, while the rest narrowly escaped, plummeting into the chasm below. Heavy fire from above forced them to scale the walls, but their climbing skills proved invaluable, and they secured the first floor with ruthless efficiency. As they advanced through the building, Vandar caught sight of a transport ship on the roof. High above the skyscrapers, at the pinnacle of the dome, he saw safety doors marked with warning signs. "Those doors open directly to the surface," he muttered. It was clear the rebels were working to bypass the safety protocols that prevented the airlock's activation. If they succeeded, they could escape into Jupiter's stormy atmosphere. Time was critical. Vandar split his team into pairs, ordering them to secure the roof by any means necessary. Theron, his communications officer, stayed at his side. Together, they swept through the floors with blaster fire and small explosives, dismantling improvised obstacles. The miners they encountered were poorly trained and disorganized, their resistance easily crushed. But Theron began to notice something troubling. Vandar wasn't taking his usual kill shots. His aim, once unforgivingly precise, now seemed restrained. Instead of lethal strikes, he fired to disable, leaving targets alive where possible. The turning point came when they encountered an older miner, a pot-bellied, slow-moving man who charged toward them with desperate, erratic shots. The man's fire was wild, but dangerously close. Vandar, the nearer of the two, raised his weapon, aiming for the miner's shoulder. But he hesitated. "Commander," Theron shouted, panic edging his voice. Theron raised his blaster and fired, a clean shot between the miner's eyes. The man crumpled to the ground, lifeless. "What's happened to you?" Theron demanded, his voice low and accusatory. Vandar frowned, his jaw tightening. "I'm fine," he said curtly. "Bullshit," Theron spat, glaring at him. Vandar met his gaze with icy resolve. "Let's keep moving." Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the building, the shockwave knocking them both to the ground. "What the hell was that?" Theron yelled, clutching his head as the deafening sound reverberated in his ears. Vandar staggered to his feet and moved to a nearby window. Smoke and flames engulfed the roof, the skeletal remains of the transport ship visible through the haze. "The transport," he said grimly. "It's been destroyed." Theron joined him, a smug grin spreading across his face. "One of us must have made it and taken care of it." Vandar spoke into his helmet's microphone. "Come in, all units. Status report. Repeat, status report." A crackle of static preceded the reply. "This is Alpha. Enemy transport destroyed. Pursuing fugitives on the west side of the building." Vandar checked his schematic. "They're heading toward the private apartment complex," he said. "They're trapped," Theron said with a grin, loading his blaster. "Let's finish this." They rounded a corner and spotted the fugitives. A man and woman sprinting for the apartment doorway. A small girl clutched in the man's arms. Vandar's breath caught. These weren't miners or soldiers, they were civilians. Theron opened fire, shattering the door's glass panels in a hail of bullets. The family dove to the ground, shielding themselves as shards of glass rained down. "Theron!" Vandar shouted, shoving the blaster down. "Stand down!" "What the hell are you talking about?" Theron snapped. "They're traitors." "And they're unarmed," Vandar countered. "I want them interrogated." Theron sneered, but lowered his weapon. "Since when?" Vandar ignored him and pushed through the broken door. Inside the apartment, the family huddled against the wall. The woman sobbed, her bruised face streaked with tears. The child's wide eyes were fixed on Vandar, her body trembling. The man stepped forward, his expression resolute despite his fear. "My name is Arapeta," he said. "Take my life for the Kaldros, but spare the woman and child. I alone am the traitor." Theron spat on the floor. "You're not in a position to make demands." Vandar silenced him with a sharp gesture. He studied Arapeta, noting the man's composure and his attire, which marked him as someone of rank. "What is the reason for your betrayal?" Vandar asked. "Why resist the Kaldros?" Arapeta met his gaze. "The Kaldros is no savior," he said. "He's a tyrant who bends the laws of nature to his will. He's not just ruling us, he's twisting the very fabric of time itself, and it will destroy us all." Vandar stared at him, stunned. Then he noticed the silver bracelet on Arapeta's wrist, its design unlike anything he'd seen. "I had to try," Arapeta continued. "The free world must know. They are our last hope." "You failed," Vandar said quietly, his tone reflective. "To try was all we could do," Arapeta replied. "The truth must outlive us." Before Vandar could respond, the room lit up with blaster fire. Theron fired without warning, the shot hitting Arapeta squarely in the chest. The man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. "Bastard!" Vandar roared, striking Theron with the butt of his weapon. The blow sent him sprawling, his blaster firing wildly. Vandar turned just in time to see the woman and child collapse, their bodies riddled with stray shots. Vandar froze, his breath caught in his throat. "What have you done?" he whispered. Theron, dazed, tried to raise his weapon again, but Vandar fired first. Theron crumpled to the floor, lifeless, a pool of blood spreading around him. Vandar stood there, his blaster still raised. Around him lay the bodies of the family and his soldier. The silence pressed in, suffocating. What am I becoming? Chapter 20. Vandar stood frozen, as still as a statue. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing to the carnage around him. He stared at Theron's lifeless body, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a crushing tide. Had he really just killed another Kaldrostom officer? His eyes drifted toward the fugitives. They too lay motionless. He stumbled backward, his weapon slipping from his hand with a clatter. Slowly, he approached the bodies, his breathing shallow and ragged. The man's head was unrecognizable, shattered by Theron's blaster. The little girl lay limp, her eyes wide but lifeless. Vandar's knees buckled, and he collapsed in front of her. For the first time in his life as a soldier, he cried. He reached out and touched the girl's tiny hand. It was still warm. He cradled it in his own and whimpered, his tears soaking into the cold floor. Then a faint groan broke through the silence. Vandar's head snapped up. The sound had come from the woman, slumped against the wall. He rushed to her side. Blood seeped from her abdomen, staining her clothes. She looked up at him, her eyes desperate but strangely calm. I'm sorry, Vandar said, the words spilling out of him. He repeated them again and again. They were all he had. The woman stared at him, her expression softening despite the pain. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling. He leaned closer. What do you need? Tell me. Her lips quivered. You are the only chance to stop the Kaldros. Vandar's brow furrowed. Stop the Kaldros? He spluttered, the idea absurd and unimaginable. You must, she said, her words coming slower now, her strength fading. Desperate to help her, Vandar dug into his first aid kit. He pulled out a small glass vial, snapped it open, and handed it to her. Drink this, he urged. She took it, her hand trembling. He sprayed an aerosol over her wound, the medical sealant stinging as it made contact. This will stop the bleeding, he said, though he knew it was a lie. She smiled faintly, seeing through him. I'm going to die, she said softly. I've known that since the day I chose to oppose the Kaldros. Vandar stared at her, struck by her quiet conviction. You're not like them, she continued, her voice weakening. He shook his head. You're wrong. I'm just as bad as all of them. No, she whispered, touching his arm. You didn't know before. Now you have a choice. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder. Vandar's head snapped toward the door. They're coming, he muttered, his heart racing. He jumped to his feet and ran to the door, slamming it shut and locking it. A heavy shelf nearby caught his eye, and he dragged it across the door to barricade it. The banging started moments later, loud and insistent. The troopers wouldn't wait long before using explosives to breach the door. We have to move, Vandar said, glancing around the apartment. Wait, the woman rasped. She gestured toward her husband's body. The bracelet, take it. Vandar hurried to the man's body, unfastening the silver bracelet from his wrist. Meanwhile, the woman rummaged through her pockets, pulling out a small metal case. Relief flickered across her face when she found it. Vandar glanced nervously at the barricaded door as the pounding grew more violent. It won't fit in my pocket, he muttered, holding the bracelet. Put it on, she said firmly. Without arguing, Vandar slipped the bracelet onto his wrist and scooped her up. He carried her to the far side of the room, opening a door that led to an outdoor balcony. The air outside was smoky and thin, difficult to breathe. He set her down gently and ran back to secure the door. There's a lock button, red, she said weakly. Vandar pressed it and the door slammed shut. They'll be through eventually, he said, glancing nervously at the nearby windows overlooking the balcony. Never mind that, she replied. Vandar returned to her side, her breathing shallow. She retrieved the metal case and opened it, revealing a tiny blade and a small circuit encased in clear resin. They'll leave me to die, she said. But they'll take you for the Kaldros' military police. Vandar's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. The woman took his arm and pressed the blade against his skin, Hold still, she said. What are you— Vandar began, but stopped as she looked into his eyes. Trust me, she said. The blade cut into his arm, sharp and deliberate. Blood welled up as she worked quickly, clearing the area with her shirt. The door rattled again, followed by muffled blaster fire. Vandar flinched, but didn't resist. He owed her this. The woman inserted the circuit beneath his skin, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Almost done, she whispered, pulling out a curved needle and thread. Her face was pale now, her lips tinged with blue. She handed him the thread. Sew yourself shut, she said weakly. Vandar obeyed, his hands trembling as he worked. The process was surreal, the pain distant beneath the adrenaline coursing through him. The woman held the skin taut, guiding him despite her fading strength. When the task was done, she collapsed onto the cold concrete, her eyes heavy. What's your name? Vandar asked, his voice cracking. She smiled faintly. Aurora, she said. Her gaze shifted to the bracelet on his wrist. Hide it under your uniform, she murmured. Don't take it off. Don't let them find it. But why? Vandar asked. And the circuit, what does it do? Aurora's breaths were shallow now, but she pressed on. It's the key to the Kaldros' defenses, the time gates. The time gates? Vandar echoed, his heart pounding. She nodded faintly. Everything else. Tralonu ek Busca will guide you. Who? Vandar asked desperately, leaning closer. But Aurora's eyes fluttered shut. Her body went still in his arms. Aurora? He called, shaking her gently. Aurora! But she was gone.